Here is Diamine Desert Burst, a brown ink. I got that out after the 4th time. I don't know why it took so much. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This video is being a complete disaster by me. I didn't hit record, and I'm assuming I hit record if you're hearing my voice. So we're going to do this a bit old school, where the writing sample is already down. Now, this is a great golden brown that in the writing samples seems to not shade and show tone variation, but thankfully the pen you get to see, it's shading really, really well. Now, even in the lighter tones that came from the writing sample, it's easy to read on the page. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it generally performed as well as it did on the more premium stuff. In the right pen, this is awesome. But in the wrong pen, namely, as a spoiler, something that's a little too dry, it's underwhelming. I like it even in the drier pens, but it's not nearly as good as what you're getting to see right here.
All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Retro 51 Tornado.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, I'd say this is the lightest tone we're going to get, but this is the tone we're going to get. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, even with it being this nice golden brown tone that we're getting from this pen. Just look at the shading that we're getting on Scrambled, where the S is a bit darker than the CR, but the beginning of the A does get a bit darker. It lightens up into the M. The B gets quite a bit darker, lightening its bridge to the L. Lightening again, dark at the L, lightening at the E, lightening some more at the beginning of the D, and a very dark end of that D. Quite nice. Looking at the medium nib, you can see it is the same tone as the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well. Jess looked at the third line, set it past tense in the present, being fancy with this throwback video. The L is quite a bit darker. It lightens its way through both O's in the K, E, D at the end. It does darken up a bit. I like what I'm seeing without a doubt. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does not feather and it does not spread. I found the shading to be quite nice with found on the first line, where the F is a bit darker, especially in the bottom where it crosses that T of track. Now the OU are a nice mid-tone. The N and beginning of the D lighten up quite a bit. It's the end of the D that gets quite a bit darker, like it rediscovered some of its shading. Not that it nearly needed to. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There was approximately 13 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not that that was any kind of a problem, but this is a beautiful tone on the page with no feathering, with no spread, still shading very well with still on the first or third line, where the STI are lighter, but the first L gets quite a bit darker. The second L starts lightening up a little bit, shows a little bit of that ombre effect at the top of that L, not by a narrow margin. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, they say, looking at they on the third line, where the T is lighter than the H. The E lightens just a little bit. The Y starts to lighten up a little bit more until you get to that downstroke that it starts to shade even better. It's mountains of shading. See, mountains. You can get to see all the stupid joking I do with myself in editing, and then you're going to start looking for this in other videos. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading going on. You don't have to gaze very hard to see it when you look at gazing on the third line. The bottom of that G does get quite a bit darker. Now, most of this is a nice light tone. It's the G at the end where you start to see it get quite a bit darker. Really, any time like the first F of cliff crosses the H of head, first and second line, where you can see really when you double back over, it gets quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There's no tone shift for being on this paper, showing that despite it being a little bit lighter as far as darkness goes, it's a very opaque ink. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It shades, and not silently. When we look at silently on the first line, where the top of the S is a bit lighter than the bottom of the S into the I, lightens just a little bit on the L, darkens to the E, little lighter on the E, starts working its way darker with the TLY at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not a little bit when you look at little on the first line, where most of it looks like it's a lighter tone, and it's the T's in the middle with the cross of the T that are quite a bit darker. Same with the dot of the I. Not like that's the only place it goes. There's quiet moments of shading where the Q is a little bit darker than the U, I, E, but the T at the end gets quite a bit darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not as well as it did with the medium. Kind of surprising, but it is the overhang of that, and there's no overhang, I'm just trying to find the word. Overhang, you see the O is lighter than the VER, and the hang at the end does get just a little bit darker. There is some shading from time to time, like from starts darker, works its way lighter. Further along, you see more shading with the F being darker, the URT lighten up a little bit, but the H quite a bit darker, and the ER at the end lighter again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, even though there's a couple deeper spots. I think you could write on the back of this page without a problem.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does do some very nice shading, showing some darker areas. Take a look at dark on the first line, where the beginning of the D is lighter than the up and down stroke into the A. Now the R lightens up a little bit and the K goes to a nice mid-tone. Crack on with that. Great job. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. I forgot to mention during the extra fine, it does stand out, I think, fairly well against the quad rule. I'm not seeing any problem with it on the up and down stroke, though I will say it looks like once in a blue moon, it does get a little broken up, like on ground, where it seems to break at the G when crossing over that vertical line. Now, the shading is not hard to find. Take a look at that on the first line, where the T is a nice mid-tone. The H gets very dark. The A lightens up a little bit, and the T at the end gets quite a bit darker. Smooth transition. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. There is shading. Take a look at there on the second line, where the T is quite a bit lighter than the H. The ER lighten up a little bit, and then the E at the end gets much darker. Signs of shading everywhere. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company Honus Wagner Infield Brown. Here is Diatramentis Nikola Tolstoy Khaki. Here is Krishna Dark Chocolate. Here is Private Reserve Chocolate.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, yet it is not hard to find. Take a look at yet on the first line, where it is the crossing in the Y that you start to see some of the darker areas in that downstroke. Mostly the YE is a nice midtone. The T at the end gets very dark. They didn't have a problem spotting it with they right next to that, where the T is a lighter tone into the H. It gets very dark at the H, lightening a little bit at the Y, at the E, very dark at the downstroke of the Y. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with fragments of shading. When we look at fragments right on the first line, first word, the F is quite dark. It lightens up into the R, into the A. It's during the A and beginning of G. It's quite a bit darker. Lightens its way through the G into the men, but the T at the end, the TS, darken just a little bit. Whew. I might need to be rested a little bit after this one. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread. The shading is there, not as standout as it was with the other nibs, in my opinion, but I am prepared to be able to show you some. Where prepared on the third line, the P is a little bit darker than the re in the middle. The next P darkens up a little bit. Little lighter into the A, little lighter into the R, very dark at the E, much lighter at the D at the end. A lot of shading going on there. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Robert Oster Cherry Blossom. Here is Scribo Vert Prato. Here is Mont Blanc Lucky Orange. Here is Noodler's Blue Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is some feathering. There is a tiny bit of spread. It gets about to a medium. There is some shading that is definitely going on there. The biggest thing about this is it usable? And I think what we're seeing here is certainly usable. It's serviceable there. I just don't know that the color would be as appreciated. Not that the color is actually shifted, it's just the tone we're getting is only, I don't know, it just doesn't look as good. I think that's the way to go. It just doesn't look too good. I'm being biased against this 20-pound toilet paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. It does feather. It does spread. It does have a couple tiny moments of shading. It is a serviceable ink on this paper. If you wanted to use it, I think you could. I don't think it's the best choice for it. I'm going to take back what I said about the color on it. I really don't think it's horrible. I think the color in general of this ink's been pretty pleasant, and it's keeping that pleasant tone here. I'm just being a curmudgeon about this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It does feather. It does spread. It does have moments of shading. It does perform just as well as it did with the medium and with the extra fine. It's not horrible. It's serviceable. This is a pretty decent ink for this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you can see the ink gets deep into the paper, so I don't know that you'd want to use both sides of the page. However, nothing bled through, nothing touched the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
All three writing sample pens looked the same, and they all shaded nicely, though thank goodness for this Retro 51 that has an older Bach nib to it. It's much wetter, and it makes this show how truly awesome the tone and shading of this ink can be. So to me, it's not even going to be about the nib size on this, but more how wet that pen is. I think you need a very wet pen. Otherwise, this can be disappointing.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.